Hello, Professor McCready. This is the video presentation from my dissertation Prospectus about gender bias against women in engineering and project management disciplines. Let's get started. The purpose of the study is to analyze select causes that cause gender bias against women in the workplace, particularly in engineering and project management disciplines. There is a mindset that women are inferior gender, they are incapable or incompetent, and that they are not readily accepted in fields like engineering and project management. The reason for these three beliefs and stereotypical attitudes is the aim of the study. And also, a remedial process is expected to be developed at the end of the study, depending upon the findings. The three critical elements that the study is going to explore is employment opportunities, growth opportunities, and pay scale disparities between men and women. An inductive approach is going to be followed, and the end process is potentially a gamified process that is going to educate businesses and organizations on how to mitigate the issue of gender bias against women in organizations. There has been a lot of study and research and in-depth research about the topic of gender bias. Gender bias has been recognized as an issue since 1980s, as early as 1980s, which was just a few decades after women started to work and women started entering into the workplace. Gender bias, according to Wallen, is persistent from the hiring through the firing process, the hiring, the evaluations, the availability of good projects for women, the pay scale, promotions. The whole process is based on a certain underlying bias against women. Women are believed to be physically, emotionally, and intellectually inferior to men. The statistics show that there are only small percentages of women that are present in executive positions, managerial positions, or in the C-suite positions. The level of women keeps decreasing as the role or the higher the position is on the corporate ladder. It is observed that although women do occupy a good percentage of jobs in the job market, in the entire statistics of jobs, the progress of women is far less as compared to that of men. The progress is much slower. It demands much more effort, and the rewards are much smaller as compared to those for men. Women are not only discriminated against based on the fact that they're women, but also against other aspects like age, race, marital status, and motherhood. As we further research and go further into the study, motherhood plays quite a significant role in the gender bias. Although first-generation gender bias is not as prevalent, there are other forms of gender bias, like unconscious and second-generation bias, that are just as strong, just as prevalent as they were, as the first-generation gender bias being prevalent in um, the beginning of 1980s or 1970s. The research shows that gender bias is twice as much and twice as prevalent and in STEM fields as it is in other fields. One research says that the reason for this is women are accepted as long as the job position that is does not entail intellectual thought, does not entail issues where critical thinking is necessary, decision making is necessary. It accepts women so long as the only demand of the job is hard work, and it does not demand too much of mind work. That is the reason this study is focused on engineering and project management fields and gender bias against women in those fields in particular. Again, the critical elements that have been identified and are going to be explored and researched are employment and growth opportunities and pay scale. Critical management systems is a tool for this study to analyze the reasons for these disparities. One of the main tenets of the critical management studies is that it works to research about socioeconomic oppression and exploitation of the workforce across various fields. And this tenet of the critical management studies is well tied to the current research or this study, as both of them are driving towards realizing and identifying and analyzing the reasons for gender bias with respect to employment, growth, pay, opportunities. The purpose of this research is to identify, analyze, and recommend an implementable process pertaining to gender bias against women in engineering and project management fields with respect to employment and growth opportunities and pay scale. The conceptual framework displayed in this slide, the idea behind developing this is that this is a flowchart to ensure that a fair process, a fair chance has been given to both men and women, and it is to ensure that gender bias or biases of any sort do not infiltrate the process. The basic requirements when a hiring committee interviews two applicants or multiple applicants is whether they're qualified educationally for that particular position, whether they're capable of handling the demands of that job position, if they are skilled enough for the role. And if they are, it is imperative that the hiring process give the same chance to a woman as it does to a man, without altering the job description or any other requirements. The same kind of hiring process is needed to be applied while recruiting, with the same amount of difficulty in assessing the skill level, the equal chances of proving themselves, and most importantly, a bias-free mind to analyze and evaluate the individuals, irrespective of any gender biases. Pay scale and promotions and evaluations are also imperative. It's also imperative that they depend solely on the performance of the individual, the level of expertise that they bring to the position, the amount of knowledge they possess, the success rate of the projects undertaken, and the decision-making capabilities, and things of that nature. The significance of the study is to basically develop a process that is going to help businesses and organizations realize and weed out second generation and unconscious bias, and give equal opportunities for both men and women. The figure shows the percentage difference, or the amount of money that women make as compared to men in certain fields like computer and mathematical, community and social service, educational training, architecture, and engineering. The amount of money that women make according to statistics is only accounts to a portion of what is earned by men. Similarly, the amount of job positions occupied by women is only a fraction of that occupied by men in these different various organizational fields. The research questions are basically 4. The first thing is, we want to identify and verify that gender bias actually exists in the workplace of engineering and management fields against women, and to identify to what extent gender bias exists. How does it affect the employment opportunities, growth opportunities, and pay scale disparities? The next research goal is to analyze the causes for gender bias and compare it to the elements that have been identified for the study. It is going to be compared to various attributes across various organizations as well. Analyzing the causality of gender bias against women is the next goal of the study. And finally, the research aims at assessing the ability of the proposed method in analyzing its implementation capabilities to future methodologies, future situations and standards, and possibly for a global implementation. The literature review is expected to concentrate on the psychological and sociological theories that attribute to the prevalence of gender bias. As mentioned, although first-generation bias doesn't exist as rampantly in the present day, there are other forms of bias like second-generation bias and unconscious bias that are equally as damaging. Second-generation bias takes place in the form of organizational policies and organizational regulations that unconsciously favor men while discriminating against women. It gives rise to gendered work, scarcity of role models for women, the lack of networks and the lack of access to networks and sponsors for women, and double binds. Double binds meaning what is the level or how does a woman assert her role in a managerial position or in a decision-making position. When a woman is too feminine, she's perceived as someone who is incompetent for the position. At the same time, if she's too masculine and assertive, she's perceived as someone who is arrogant and unfit or not fit for the job. Those are a few of the issues that take place as a result of second-generation bias. The glass ceiling phenomenon states that it is twice as hard for women, if not harder, to reach top-level positions or C-suite positions than it is for men. They are continually put under the microscope, and they are required to prove themselves constantly to achieve any sort of remuneration or recognition or a chance for promotions and progress and growth through the organization. The sociological theories of gender discrimination that aid gender bias and are a strong reason for gender bias still being prevalent in this day and age are structural functionalist, conflict theory, and symbolic interactionist theory. The structural functionalist theory is one of the oldest theories in the fundamental theories that states that it is important for men and women to assume different positions or jobs in order for the society to function smoothly. The conflict theory states that the bias against women comes in the form of patriarchy. The men are perceived to be the breadwinners and decision makers in a family, and the women are the ones who are supposed to take a back seat and follow instructions. And the symbolic interactionist theory is a contemporary theory that states that gender is formed through the basic everyday interactions between men and women. It further states that gender is fluid and can be changed through those everyday interactions. The other theory is the feminist theory, which works towards empowering women. And it does help to fight against discrimination against women for the most part, but is not readily accepted by the society. Researchers have realized or have recognized certain recurring patterns of gender bias against women in organizations over the years. Prove It Again is a pattern which again states that women are expected to prove themselves continually, and they are expected to prove themselves much more times than men are. Tightroping is, again, it basically is double binds, where women have to achieve a balance of how feminine or how masculine they need to present themselves to achieve the kind of recognition that is needed to be in a managerial position or an executive position. Maternal wall is a deep-rooted belief that mothers are far less dedicated to their jobs as compared to women who are not mothers. It is a belief that mothers' priorities lie with their children, and because of this, their concentration on fulfilling their roles is reduced by a great factor. This is a discouraging belief because those mothers who put in extra work to be good at both jobs of being a mother as well as doing their organizational jobs are still discriminated against just for the fact of them being a mother. This is one other type of second generation and unconscious bias that really hinders the growth of women. And as a result, it is the reason for women not being able to achieve executive positions, C-suite positions. The tug of war. This pattern states that women who have encountered gender bias early on in their jobs tend to isolate themselves from other women and men alike. And they are perceived as arrogant as a result of this by other women. And hence, they are not expected to progress through the organization, or when they do progress, they are not readily accepted as leaders. Statistical discrimination and taste-based discrimination are two faces of gender bias with two different definitions. They are underlying unconscious second-generation biases, which are so deeply rooted and difficult to remove, much more difficult to remove than first-generation bias or any other kind of bias. Statistical discrimination states that people have preconceived beliefs about the ability of men and women. They believe that men and women are not equally able to do all types of jobs, be it physically different in their physical abilities, mental abilities, emotional abilities, intellectual abilities. The statistical discrimination believes that they are different and they are meant for different jobs. Taste-based discrimination states that people tend to discriminate based on stereotype and favoritism. Sometimes women who are in the hiring committee may tend to gravitate towards other women applicants. At the same time, men who are hiring somebody for a job may tend to gravitate towards men, and hence there's a disparity they tend to recruit one or the other person, even though there's a difference between either qualifications or experience or any other aspect or any other requirement for the job. The figure displays the percentage of women in different tiers of the organization. As we see, again, the percentage reduces as the ladder progresses upwards, or as the pyramid progresses upwards. And the CEOs constitute only 5.2% women in the engineering and project management fields. This study, this statistics comes from 500 S&P 500 companies. The research is expected to follow an inductive approach, as mentioned earlier. Statistic analysis is important in analyzing the statistics of the engineering and project management fields, the positions that women have acquired, what they bring to the job, the amount of knowledge that is expected from them, the amount of responsibility that is placed on them, the differences in the kind of work that is assigned to men and women, are the differences in the quality and importance of the work that is, the projects that are given to men and women, and so on and so forth. The gender equity in organizational context is the statistic that is going to be assessed by measuring the different sub-elements that have been identified, which act as a supporting indicators to the three critical elements, that is employment opportunities, growth opportunities, and pay scale. Point-in-time surveys, Likert questionnaires, they are going to be used to analyze gender bias and determine the efficiency of the reform practices or the process, the potential final process. Stratified sampling approach is going to be employed for case studies, and rounded theory is going to be used for analyzing gender bias and evaluating the results of the case studies. The potential final product is a process that drives at educating businesses and organizations about the different unconscious gender biases against women that are quite prevalent in the mindsets of employees, and it is expected to urge organizations to change their reform their policies and reform the policies and their basic structures that might unconsciously be favoring men and not women. Increase the accountability of the decision makers, reevaluate decision-making criteria, and also train managers and executive level employees about these kind of unconscious biases. Women empowerment is equally important for organizations to do. Train them about the different kinds of gender bias they might encounter, unconscious gender bias, about their ability to use their skills and their ability to make themselves more known in the organizations by speaking out about their rights or their knowledge, their skills, etc. Negotiating skills, train them to negotiate like men without any kind of fear or inferiority complex or that might be holding them back. Conclusions of the study are that there is quite significant amounts of gender bias against women, which takes place in form of employment opportunities, unequal employment opportunities, unequal growth opportunities, unequal pay. And the reasons for these biases to still exist lies in the deep psychological and sociological teachings that have been embedded into the mindsets and the attitudes of the society. Subtle and implicit biases are the most difficult and damaging. And accountability for unconscious and conscious bias and women empowerment is as important to remove gender bias as any other rules and regulations. The limitations are that the study is conducted only within the United States and only in the engineering and project management sectors. And it's also the researchers' limited experience in various departments and the lack of personal experience with first-hand gender bias, which are the limitations for the research. The research is expected to add a dedicated process which is going to help organizations and businesses eradicate gender bias, or at least start by identifying and changing rules and regulations and organizational strategies. Stereotypical mindsets and attitudes are supposed to be given up in order to give a fair chance for women to achieve or attain equality in the workplace. The process tends to make this education of organizations one that is going to be always on the top, always on in the minds of people, and continuously be conscious about this. The potential outcome of the study is a process that is expandable and scalable to use in other sectors. Although the study concentrates only in engineering and project management domains, the outcome is a process that is expected to be able to be implemented in other sectors and also across other global locations. And these are the references that have been used for the preparation of this PowerPoint. And I will conclude my presentation and see you soon.